So if you've paid attention in the wargaming hobby over the past couple days, actually I think it was just since yesterday, you are aware that Richard Berg, a prolific wargame designer of many decades, passed away either yesterday or the day before. It just coincidentally, as it turned out, I'd been sort of languishing over this game of Beneventum, which is from SPQR, which is one of the original, I think it was the second, volume 2, the second title in the Great Battles of History series, which was designed by Richard Berg and Mark Herman, and was one of kind of the staples of Richard Berg's designs. I think there was 15 titles in the Great Battles of History series, the most recent being Hoplite, which was pre-Alexander Greek combat. So it just sort of brought it home to me as I was playing Beneventum and heard about him passing away. That made me just kind of reflect a little bit on what he's done for wargame design and for the hobby as a whole. And it's kind of funny because Beneventum, this is the first scenario in SPQR, the first of the base scenarios. I mean, there's a number of expansions for SPQR, but Beneventum was the first scenario, and this was Pyrrhus of Epirus against the Romans. And this particular scenario, there was a couple of setups for it. The one setup was the sort of fixed battle scenario, which was the Epirote forces against the Romans, with the Romans having exited their camp and set up to fight the battle in the field, which I think is set up out in this area. The more complicated and recommended only if you really know what you're doing scenario was with the Romans in the camp and the Epirote forces approaching along this road, and I think a little bit to the south there. And you can see these lines here. What the Epirotes did was approach at night and into dawn, and these lines are the turn points at which the Romans can see them approaching. So I had set it up so that the Epirotes wouldn't get to the line too quickly for the Romans to see them in the dawn light, to sort of maximize the surprise that the Epirotes would have. And this turned out to be pretty smart for the Epirotes, as the Romans, the movement in the camp is so restrictive that it actually has its own entire table, Roman camp terrain effects. And I'm not sure how many other camps are even in the game, frankly. This may be the only one. But nonetheless, it had a significant chunk of real estate devoted to it on one of the SPQR player aids. And as it turns out, I really didn't know what I was doing with the ability of these units to move out of the camp and organize into a reasonable fighting force against the Epirotes. And the Romans, I mean, in terms of firepower, as it were, are largely better troops than what the Epirotes have. The Epirotes have some medium infantry, a couple of heavy infantry units that are decent, and some phalanxes. And the Romans are classic Roman legion forces that have a lot of 7s and 8s in terms of TQ, whereas the Epirotes were 5s and 6s. The Epirotes did have more cavalry and better cavalry, but that's no surprise when you're dealing with Roman forces. The Romans are, the cav was always their notoriously weak point. So, and you can see here the orange units are the Epirote cavalry, and there's no Roman cavalry left. They were able to pretty quickly eliminate the Roman cavalry, and you can see over here that it was a pretty resounding defeat for the Romans. I think I'm at 124 points, route points for the Romans. Their route level was 120. Lots of legionnaire infantry was destroyed. Not nearly as much Epirote stuff was destroyed. So the Romans were trying to get them out of the camp was just the biggest problem, and trying to organize them into any kind of fighting force out in front of the camp. Really bringing them out this way was a mistake. I thought I could get them out fast enough. I couldn't, and the Epirotes just kind of smashed into them and picked them off piecemeal. I mean, you can see there's a couple depleted phalanxes there, so there were some routes that did happen. I was able to use Pyrrhus to rally those forces pretty quickly, because if you don't rally phalanxes, they don't route move, they just die. So you want to make sure if your phalanxes route, that you do rally them. But just getting them to route is very difficult. This phalanx here was, over its route points a number of times through shock combat, but due to the phalanx exception for route rules, would continually roll to stand. So the phalanxes proved to be very resilient and very difficult to route. So I would say take the scenario rules to heart for Beneventum, and make sure that you know what you're doing before you try and do the full approach to camp scenario, because clearly I didn't know what I was doing, and the Romans got completely annihilated. And I don't think it should be, I don't think the battle is set up in favor of the Epirotes, just because the Romans are the quality of the Roman troops is generally better. But in these early days of the Roman Republic, the leadership is what really hamstrings the Romans, where you've got these weaker leaders, these prefects and tribunes that can only command certain types of units, and they're very low initiative capability. So the leadership of the Romans made it very difficult for them to command a group of units that got increasingly spread out as they tried to get out of the camp. As you can see here, these guys are pretty well organized on this flank of the camp, but up here, not nearly so much. So it just became more and more difficult to command them once they get spread out. When you get beyond the point of these guys being able to give line commands, then they're only commanding 2 and 3 units at a time, and that's just not enough to move your army quickly. So it turns out to be a real problem for the Romans in this scenario. So anyway, this I probably set this up like 2 or 3 months ago, and just now finally finished it. So it had been sitting here for months, but reading about Berg and his unfortunate passing led me to say, you know what, I'm going to sit down and enjoy the end of this and finish it. But it's funny, this is one of the scenarios that has what I would call one of the most Bergian of tables. So Berg was famous for adding lots of fun chrome to his games. In addition to writing very entertaining rules, he would often put little quips and anecdotes and sarcastic asides into his rules. And Great Battles of History was no exception. But he's known for having some crazy chromy tables in his war games too. And so one of the unique aspects of Beneventum was, for one thing, they have these, the Roman camp has these Scorpio units. So having flaming bolts was one thing. I don't believe there was a table for the flaming bolts. It was just a optional rule in the game here. Yeah, the Scorpion's fiery sting, or what a flaming arrow you are. So this is the kind of stuff that Berg was just known for. So I didn't actually use the flaming bolts optional one, but I did do this one, the Roman flaming pigs, or bringing home the bacon. So this talks about this largely apocryphal story that in this battle potentially the Romans lit pigs on fire and ran them towards the the Epirot elephants in an attempt to scare them off the field. As it points out here, as everyone knows, elephants under strain have an unusual fear of small animals and make screeching noises. Someone appears to experiment with the idea of letting a few porkers loose amongst the behemoths, as little else seemed to be working. When this had some effect, the military-industrial complex upgraded the system by tarring old Porky with some pitch, setting him ablaze, letting him loose, and then bada. That's all, folks. So you can see, and this leads to one of the more infamous tables in the series, the Flaming Pig table. And so I actually did this in the game, and I think it was twice during the game, and both times I tried it, I rolled on the 1 to 7, no effect, but breakfast is served because, you know, flaming pigs smells like bacon. But you do have the option, if you roll a 9, to actually screw with the elephants pretty badly, or an 8 or a 9, frankly. And then what did this one do? Attacks linear, so this just makes them attack. This actually inflicts damage. So, flaming pig table. Just kind of gave me a chuckle, and just, you know, with Berg passing away, made me think of this scenario as having what I would consider the ultimate Berg table, and that might be something to add to the comments for anybody who's watching. What if you can think of an ultimate Berg bit of chrome or table? If you can think of one, please post in the comments and let me know. I think there's been a lot of them over the years, given the dozens, maybe hundreds. I don't know if he's designed hundreds of games, or maybe had his maybe not hundreds, but maybe over 100 games in his lifetime. He'd been designing since, the 70s at least, if not prior to that, but got his start at SPI in the 70s. And most notably with Terrible Swift Sword, one of the first monster games, an epic level treatment of the Battle of Gettysburg. I did the most recent version of that, which was 3 Days of Gettysburg, part of the GMT Great Battles of the American Civil War series, which was kind of the next iteration of, or more modernized iteration of Berg's Terrible Swift Sword system. So for Beneventum here, ended up being a bad Roman defeat, which flew against history. Historically, the Epirotes tried to attack the camp and failed initially, and then ended up fighting more of a pitched battle against an assembled Roman force in the open plains here next to the camp, and ended up losing there. But otherwise, speaking of the great battles of the American Civil War, I do still have set up here, and I think I showed this in my last video, the setup full battle of Stones River, which is Dead of Winter from the Great Battles of the American Civil War series. It is unchanged. I think this is sat here in setup mode for 2 months, maybe more. I don't think I've had this set up as long as I had Beneventum set up, but it is, now that I've gotten my other distractions out of the way, I can finally get started on this. I would like to certainly get started on it before I head to the battlefield in late August. So within the next 2 weeks, hopefully I can get at least some turns in of this before I'm actually walking around the battlefield, just to familiarize myself with the battle and the battlefield before actually touring the battlefield. So over here was 3 Days of Gettysburg. So these are all the games that I have from the Great Battles of the American Civil War series, which again was heavily Berg influenced, although he did not design all of these games. In fact, 3 Days of Gettysburg may be the only one that I have that he actually designed, and then I don't know if there's been credit. Game designer, developer. Yeah, so this one gives him game design credit. I think most of the others were actually designed by other people, and they do. Well, this one gives him game design credit. Some of the others will give him system. This is the Bull Run, first and second Bull Run. This is Gringo. Did he do these? Yeah, he's got game designer there too. Because this one, I thought, yeah, game designer. So Dave Powell did Dead of Winter. So Berg gets the series design credit. So he sort of handed off in later iterations, and then Twin Peaks, I'm pretty sure he didn't do that either. This would be, yeah, series designer. This is game designer is Greg Labago. So he gets a co-design credit on Twin Peaks. So he did either one or both, was involved in either one or both of the battles that Twin Peaks do. But and then the latest one will be Death Valley, which will be the Shenandoah Valley stuff. Trying to think of other titles that Berg did. This was the Glory system. I believe this was Berg system. Yep. So he designed these. There was 3 games in that series. World War II stuff, you've got the Desert Fox, which was sort of a precursor to what OCS turns into, which was a very supply-heavy operational management, supply management operational level World War II design, which I've played before but haven't revisited since it was redesigned by Decision Games for one of their S&T issues from a few years ago. And I think they're releasing a boxed version of it as well. I'm just looking at my other GMT titles that Berg designed. I don't know of other modern. I don't know that he did any World War II designs in recent years. Here's all the Great Battles of History titles, SPQR, on the shelf there. And he was involved at some level in all these. I think some of them may have been similar to the Great Battles of the American Civil War, of him being getting the series credit and not doing the actual game design. And then he did this. This was one of his more recent releases. It's a CDG on Bronze Age. And then this, which I think I'm saddest about, with his passing, of this series likely never being expanded upon. I know he had been working on a Second Punic War title, Thunderbolt, and then potentially more titles in this. But this was the operational level Ancient series, very unique, really nothing like it in the hobby, and will be greatly missed. That if I'm not sure if his future volumes of this are still being developed, and I want to say, totally drawing a blank on the developer. I'm not sure if he's on here, listed on here as the developer. Alan Ray, that's who I'm thinking of. I'm not sure if Alan has enough to get Thunderbolt over the finish line on his own, or if he still needed Berg's involvement on that. It would be awesome if Alan Ray, who's been tireless in sort of servicing this Ancient World series over the years, would be awesome if he could bring that third volume home. Thunderbolt would be really cool. Pax Romana, I believe this was also a Berg design. I think Genesis is sort of a version of Pax Romana of that CDG system. Onward Christian Soldiers is a Berg design. I've played this, covered on video, at least at the First Crusade. This was very entertaining CDG, and a re-implementation of the SPI title, The Crusades, which I think was Berg's original title on The Crusades. Men of Iron, another Berg series. I'm not sure what his involvement was, and these seem to be out of order. Infidels, actually the second one. Blood and Roses the third. Arquebus the fourth. But he designed the series. I'm not sure to what level he designed each battle of these future titles. I know Ralph Shelton was the big developer on these, and has been involved in a lot of work, at least of play testing all the individual battles. So I'm not sure which ones Berg designed himself and which Ralph worked on or others worked on, or whether, if any. Medieval, as Berg has said, this was probably his favorite design. One of the few of his games that he actually played. Had been re-implemented in recent years as part of a Kickstarter, sort of modernized and updated version of it, I believe, with his blessing. Other Berg titles here. I think that's it of what I have of GMT titles. Here you can see he's focused mainly in the Ancients era and Civil War era. I don't know. He did mostly stuff for GMT in recent years. I'm trying to think of other companies that I have that have games that he designed. I don't know if he did any Compass designs or not. Victory games, possibly he did some of these, but this was post SPI era, and he never worked directly for Victory games, not to the involvement that, say, Mark Herman had with Victory games. Old Avalon Hill titles, I believe Conquistador was one of his. I don't think he did any of these other ones. Britannia, Kremlin. Of the SPI titles he had, I believe this was his, and I'm not sure if he did some of the Art of Siege titles or not. Did he do Armada? This doesn't have a designer's name on the box, so I don't know. I don't know if he did Armada or not. It seems like one that he would have done. Here's my TSR copy of Terrible Swift Sword. I don't have the original SPI version, but that was definitely his design. He did Druid down there on the bottom shelf. That was a Berg design. He did these here, Famous Victory and Fields of Glory. Well, I don't know that he did Fields of Glory. I believe this was his, though. This was not the Battle of, I want to say Marlborough, Blenheim, thank you. That's where Marlborough, Lord Marlborough made his name at the Battle of Blenheim. I think Berg did a title for Hollenspiel. I don't have it. It's the one on it's called Dynasty or something like that on ancient or medieval China. Murfreesboro just did video coverage of that recently. That was a Berg design. Don't believe any of the rest of these were. Neither of my flat packs are Berg designs either. So I think that's all I have. I've got some S&T titles that he did, and he did a lot of them, I think, over the years. But I won't dig all those out and go through them. Just a nice sort of reminiscing through all the stuff that he's worked on over the years. So it does make me want to get into Stones River finally after it's sitting here for so many months. The other thing that I'm working on, and this was something somebody had asked me about after my last video, was what my thoughts were on Pax Britannica. It is one of my favorite games to play just because I love the era so much. I just started reading Dreadnought by, was it Richard Massey? Charles Massey? I don't know. The author's last name is Massey, but he's written a lot of books, particularly about Russian history, Nicholas and Alexandra and so forth. But one of his other specialties was the pre-World War I naval arms race between Britain and Germany that sort of led to World War I. So I just started reading that, which gets me into the sort of Pax Britannica mood and that whole Victorian era, latter half of the 19th century Britain, one of my favorite eras to study. Um, I'm a huge Rudyard Kipling fan, and that whole, so, reading about that whole imperial era of Britain is always fascinating for me. And so I did an unboxing video of a pristine copy of Pax Britannica I found a couple months ago. So I got to punch these out, get the counters all nice and trimmed up and everything, and get the game set up and ready to go. But this is a fun one to play, and it's not realistic, obviously, to play it solo, but I love just exploring that era, and allowing myself to just noodle around with it solo, as opposed to trying to get a group together to actually play the game. Um, Playing it solo just lets me kind of mess around and play in that sandbox of the Imperial British late 19th century era. So anyway, just a little ramble. I wanted to do a wrap up on Beneventum, given the news about Richard Berg that happened recently, and the fact that I happened to be playing it and had finally finished it. So I thought this would be a good opportunity to do a wrap up on a fun game and a classic system designed by a epic designer whose influence on the hobby is certainly legendary and will not be forgotten.